Before World War II shocked the world, there was a war so deadly it destroyed empires, erased generations, and changed humanity forever. Soldiers believed they were marching into glory, but instead they walked into hell. This was the first global war. This was World War I. For 4 long years, the world's great powers clashed in a conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality. From the muddy trenches of the Western Front to the scorching deserts of the Middle East, millions of lives were caught in the crossfire. New technologies like machine guns, tanks, and poison gas turned battlefields into slaughterhouses. Entire landscapes were scarred, and the psychological toll on soldiers was immense. This wasn't just a war between armies. It was a total war that engulfed entire societies, redrew the map of the world, and set the stage for the conflicts that would define the 20th century. Join us as we uncover the story of the Great War. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're journeying back in time to the dawn of the 20th century, a period when the world was simmering with tension, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Imagine a chessboard, but instead of pieces, you have powerful empires, each vying for more squares, more influence, and more military might. This was the reality of Europe before 1914. The great powers of the Britain with its vast navy, Germany with its industrial ambition, France still stinging from past defeats, and the sprawling, multicultural empires of Austria-Hungary and Russia were all entangled in a complex web of competition. They were carving up Africa and Asia for colonies, building bigger and deadlier battleships, and swelling the ranks of their armies. This wasn't just about resources. It was about national pride, a belief in one's own country's superiority that we call nationalism. This fervent patriotism was everywhere, in newspapers, in schools, and in political speeches. It created an atmosphere where war wasn't seen as a catastrophe, but as a glorious test of a nation's strength and destiny. To protect themselves in this high-stakes game, these nations formed alliances, promising to defend each other if attacked. This created 2 major armed camps. On one side, you had the Triple Entente, linking France, Russia, and Great Britain. On the other, the Triple Alliance, composed of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. In theory, these alliances were meant to keep the peace, a sort of early version of mutually assured destruction. The idea was that an attack on one would be an attack on all, making any aggressor think twice. But in reality, it created a domino effect. A small regional conflict could now easily escalate into a continent-wide war. Europe was a tinderbox, armed to the teeth and divided against itself. All it needed was a single fatal spark. And that spark came on a sunny June day in 1914 in the city of Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia Territory, annexed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The heir to the empire's throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie were visiting the city. For many Serbian nationalists, who dreamed of a unified Slavic state free from Austro-Hungarian rule, this visit was a provocation. As the Archduke's motorcade moved through the streets, a young Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots. Both the Archduke and his wife were killed. This single act of political violence unleashed a storm. Austria-Hungary, outraged and looking to crush Serbian nationalism once and for all, issued a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. They saw this as their chance to assert dominance in the Balkans. But behind Serbia stood its powerful Slavic ally Russia, and behind Austria-Hungary stood its ally Germany, which gave them a blank check of unconditional support. When Serbia refused to accept all of Austria-Hungary's demands, the dominoes began to fall, just as the alliance system had preordained. Within a matter of weeks, a diplomatic crisis spun completely out of control. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. In response, Russia began to mobilize its massive army to defend Serbia. Germany, seeing Russia's mobilization as a direct threat, declared war on Russia. Then, according to its long-prepared military strategy known as the Schlieffen Plan, which called for a quick strike against France before turning to face Russia, Germany declared war on France and invaded neutral Belgium to get there. Britain, sworn to protect Belgian neutrality and fearing a German-dominated Europe, had no choice but to declare war on Germany. In just over a month, a localized conflict in the Balkans had exploded into a full-blown European war. The world was on fire. The leaders and the public who sent their young men off to war in the summer of 1914 were filled with a strange mix of patriotism and naivety. The prevailing belief was that the war would be short and glorious. "Home by Christmas" was the confident cry heard across Europe. They imagined quick, decisive battles, cavalry charges, and heroic victories reminiscent of wars from a century before. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. They were sending an entire generation into the maw of a new, terrifying form of warfare, industrialized, mechanical, and utterly merciless. The reality on the front lines was a brutal shock. The romantic notions of war were shattered by the deafening roar of modern artillery and the chilling chatter of the machine gun. A single machine gun crew could mow down hundreds of advancing soldiers in minutes, turning open fields into killing grounds. The old tactics of massed infantry charges became suicidal. Generals, struggling to adapt, simply ordered more men to charge, leading to staggering casualties for mere yards of ground. The war quickly bogged down, especially on the Western Front in France and Belgium. To escape the constant hail of bullets and shrapnel, armies on both sides began to dig. They dug complex networks of trenches that soon stretched for over 450 miles, from the Swiss border all the way to the North Sea. This was the birth of trench warfare, and life inside these muddy, waterlogged ditches was a living hell. Soldiers lived in a state of constant fear, hounded by the ever-present threat of sniper fire, artillery bombardments, and poison gas attacks. The trenches were infested with rats that grew fat on corpses. Lice were a constant torment, spreading a disease known as trench fever. Food was often scarce and poor, and fresh water was a luxury. The land between the opposing trenches was called no man's land. It was a desolate, lunar landscape of shell craters, tangled barbed wire, and the unburied dead. The order to go over the top, to climb out of the trench and charge across no man's land towards the enemy, was a death sentence for millions. The dream of a quick victory had died in the mud of the trenches. The conflict had devolved into a brutal war of attrition, a gruesome stalemate where the goal was no longer to outmaneuver the enemy, but to simply outlast them, to grind them down through sheer exhaustion and bloodshed. For the soldiers in the trenches, the war became a grim test of endurance. It was a daily battle for survival against not just the enemy, but against disease, starvation, and the psychological trauma of constant bombardment and death. The Great War, as it came to be known, was unlike any conflict the world had ever seen. It was a total war that consumed the economies, societies, and spirits of the nations involved. It reshaped the map of the world, toppled empires, and left a scar on the collective memory of humanity that is still felt to this day. What began with imperial rivalries and a single assassination in Sarajevo had become a global catastrophe, a world on the edge that finally.
For 4 long years, millions of men lived, fought, and died in a vast network of muddy, rat-infested ditches that stretched across the face of Europe. This wasn't a war of grand maneuvers and heroic charges. It was a war of attrition. A daily struggle for survival where life was measured in inches and death was a constant, looming presence. Imagine waking up every day to the thunder of artillery, the ground shaking so violently it felt like the world was ending. The air is thick with the stench of decay, disinfectant, and fear. Daily life was a monotonous cycle of dread and duty. Stand to at dawn, peering over the parapet into the misty, desolate landscape of no man's land, a treacherous expanse of shell craters, barbed wire, and the bodies of fallen comrades. Moments of quiet were rare and precious, often spent writing letters home, letters filled with a desperate attempt to sound normal while living in a nightmare. First used by the Germans in 1915, chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas brought a new level of terror to the battlefield. An eerie greenish-yellow cloud would drift silently across no man's land, seeping into the trenches. The initial panic was indescribable. Soldiers fumbled with primitive gas masks, but these early versions were often ineffective. Mustard gas was particularly insidious, lingering in the soil for weeks, continuing to inflict agonizing pain on anyone who came into contact with it. For months, armies threw wave after wave of men at each other's fortified positions, fighting over the same scorched piece of earth, gaining only a few yards at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. Verdun, which lasted for almost the entire year of 1916, was a meat grinder, where the French and Germans bled each other white. Yet, amidst this unrelenting horror, the human spirit showed remarkable resilience. Soldiers from all walks of life, farmers, factory workers, clerks, and aristocrats were thrown together. They relied on each other for everything, sharing their last cigarette, a piece of bread, or a word of encouragement. This camaraderie, this sense that they were all in it together, was what kept many of them going. Their letters home paint a vivid picture of this duality, the raw fear and the deep affection for their comrades. They wrote of longing for peace, for their families, for a simple, normal life that seemed a world away. And the war wasn't confined to the battlefields. It was a total war, meaning it touched every aspect of civilian life. Entire economies were re-geared for the war effort. Factories that once made cars now produced tanks and shells. Women stepped into roles they had never held before, working in munitions factories, becoming the canary girls whose skin turned yellow from TNT poisoning on farms, and as nurses on the front lines, keeping the country running while the men were away. Food shortages became common as naval blockades cut off supplies. Rationing was introduced, and families had to make do with less. Cities were bombed from the air for the first time by German Zeppelin aircrafts and later, Gotha bombers. And of course, there was the constant, gnawing anxiety of waiting for news. Every knock on the door could be the telegram bearing the devastating news that a husband, son, or brother would not be coming home. The loss was staggering, touching nearly every family in the nations involved. World War I was a cataclysm. It was fought not just with guns and bayonets, but with industrial might, propaganda, and the resilience of ordinary people. It was a war fought in the mud of the trenches, in the factories, in the homes, and in the hearts of millions. It shattered empires, redrew the map of the world, and left behind a legacy of loss and trauma that would echo through the rest of the 20th century. By 1917, the Great War had bled Europe white. The grand armies that marched off in 1914 were gone, replaced by exhausted shell-shocked men clinging to muddy trenches. On the Western Front, the stalemate was absolute, a brutal meat grinder chewing up lives for a few feet of ravaged earth. On the Eastern Front, Russia was collapsing into revolution, its massive army dissolving. For both the Allies and the Central Powers, the situation was desperate. The war had become a battle of attrition, a race to see which side would break first. Every nation was scraping the bottom of the barrel for men, for food, for bullets, for hope. The conflict had spiraled far beyond what anyone had imagined, a catastrophic drain on the entire continent. Fresh forces, a new injection of manpower and resources, were not just needed, they were essential for survival. And then, across the Atlantic, a sleeping giant stirred. The United States, which had maintained a policy of strict neutrality for 3 years, finally entered the fray. When America declared war in April 1917, it was a turning point. The tide of the war was about to turn. The balance of power didn't shift overnight. It took months for the American presence to be truly felt on the battlefield. But the psychological impact was immediate. It was a last, desperate gamble. The initial attacks were devastatingly effective, pushing the Allies back dozens of miles. But the German army was spent. They had no reserves. Their soldiers were starving, and their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. The Allied lines bent, but they did not break. And with American reinforcements pouring in, the counterattack began. The 100 Days Offensive, starting in August 1918, was the final act. The German army, exhausted and demoralized, began to crumble. One by one, Germany's allies Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary. At home, the German people were starving due to the Allied naval blockade, and social unrest was boiling over. The military leadership finally admitted to the Kaiser that the war was lost. Facing revolution at home and total collapse at the front, Germany had no choice. They sought an armistice, a ceasefire. But this hard-won peace came at a staggering, almost unimaginable cost. The numbers are so large they become abstract, but we must try to grasp them. Over 16 million people, soldiers and civilians, were dead. Another 20 million were wounded, many maimed for life. An entire generation of young men was lost. The physical destruction was apocalyptic. Entire towns and villages in France and Belgium were wiped off the map. Vast landscapes were transformed into barren, crater-pocked wastelands, poisoned with chemical agents and littered with unexploded ordnance. The economic toll was just as severe. The great powers of Europe were bankrupt, their economies shattered. The world of 1914 was gone forever. In the aftermath, the victorious Allied powers gathered in Paris to forge a new world order. The Paris Peace Conference was dominated by the Big Four: Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Each had a different vision for the future. Wilson, the idealist, proposed his 14 points, a blueprint for a just and lasting peace, centered around a new League of Nations. But the European allies, particularly France, which had suffered so grievously, had other ideas. They wanted security, and they wanted revenge. In the end, the desire for vengeance won out over the desire for a just peace. The result was the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919. It was less a peace treaty and more a verdict. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war through the infamous War Guilt Clause. Most crippling of all were the reparations, astronomical payments demanded by the Allies that would burden the German economy for decades. The treaty was dictated, not negotiated. The German delegation was horrified, calling it a diktat, a dictated peace. They signed it under protest, knowing that to refuse would mean an invasion and the continuation of the devastating blockade. This toxic narrative would be exploited by extremist political groups, most notably the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler. The treaty failed to create a lasting peace. Instead, it created the perfect conditions for future conflict. World War I was called the war to end all wars. It was a hopeful, desperate phrase, born from the belief that such a catastrophe could never be allowed to happen again. The two conflicts are not separate events. They are intrinsically linked, two acts in the same great, tragic drama of the 20th century. It accelerated massive social changes, including the push for women's suffrage,